Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation, with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. For our pilot skills topic today, we'll be talking in more detail about instrument departures and ODPs, and in our safety focus segment, we'll be talking with Rob Mark about how GA pilots should be applying sterile cockpit rules when they fly. And finally, we'll talk with a newsmaker, the CEO of a company that has fully automated 2 Cessna aircraft. Last week in episode 172, we talked about factors you should consider when choosing an instrument approach. And we interviewed Sammy Kramer, the German pilot in the news for drawing a syringe. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. And I want to call your attention to the share button in the app that you're currently using to listen to us. For example, in the Apple Podcast app, if you tap on the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen, the share button is at the top of the list that comes up. And I'd like to ask you to use that button today and share Aviation News Talk with a friend who you think might enjoy it. So please support the show by sharing it with a friend. This week in the news, the NTSB calls for better monitoring of flight instructors. A fugitive pilot is arrested, and the Air Force has selected a popular GA tail dragger for testing. All this and more, and the news starts now. GA helps vaccine distribution. Originally, I was planning to lead off the news with a story about how GA is helping vaccine distribution. But in the process, I discovered that there's an error in a widely disseminated story about a pilot in South Carolina who was reported to be helping fly COVID-19 vaccines. The following update comes from aircaralliance.org underneath the title, "Will Volunteer Pilots Be Called Upon to Help Transport the Vaccine?" They say, while there is much in the news about the challenges of distributing the vaccine, it is still unclear whether there will be any major need for volunteer pilots to help in this regard. Distribution of vaccine is being left up to individual states, and each state is developing and deploying its own plan for distribution. Unlike PPE or other medical supplies, vaccine distribution is highly controlled. It's largely being accomplished through public-private partnerships at state and local levels, with distribution by contractors such as FedEx, UPS, and others, following strict chain of custody and temperature control protocols. Some inaccurate news stories have been circulating stating that volunteer pilots for Angel Flight Soars were delivering vaccines. These reports were false and a result of a miscommunication. What was actually being delivered was COVID-19 test specimens. Angel Flight Soars is working to correct the message with news media outlets. And by the way, I think it's commendable that pilots are helping in any way that they can, including, of course, flying COVID-19 tests. The story continues, to date there has been only one instance of volunteer pilots helping to deliver the vaccine. On December 15th, the South Dakota wing of the Civil Air Patrol transported the vaccine on behalf of the South Dakota Department of Health at the DOH request. While the Civil Air Patrol does utilize volunteer pilots, its structure, training requirements, and mission is much different from typical ACA volunteer pilot organizations. ACA is proactively working to position volunteer pilot groups to serve in the best ways they can, when and if they are needed. We have connected with the Association of Immunization Managers, a national organization that supports immunization efforts in all states and territories. While AIM is aware that ACA member organizations are available and ready to assist, there has been no defined need as of yet. From kitplanes.com, Van's shipping department quarantined until January 15th. Van's aircraft has put a hold on sending parts out the door until January 15th because the shipping department employees have been exposed to COVID-19 and are now in a 2-week quarantine. The company says it will try its best to help customers who are stranded, which are typically called AOG, or aircraft on the ground. The closure primarily affects shipments of RV parts, accessories, and hardware, but they will continue to ship RV kits, which are packed and managed by a different team. And Vans, of course, is the world's largest manufacturer of experimental kit aircraft. From generalaviationnews.com, a new mission for the Xcub. A Cub crafter's Xcub is poised to make a big impact on military personnel recovery. The GA aircraft was recently purchased by the Air Force Research Laboratory, AFRL, for its initial Lysander flying experiment, which will demonstrate the low-altitude sensing helmet system known as LASH, L-A-S-H. LASH, a portable kit developed by the AFRL's 711th Human Performance Wing's Airman System Directorate, contains specialized equipment including a flight helmet, a thermal camera, night vision goggles, and various other components. The kit can quickly and easily be installed into nearly any GA aircraft to equip pilots for low-level, low-speed, nighttime flight, something that is essential for personnel recovery and other featherweight airlift special missions, according to Dr. Darrell G. Hopper, 711th Human Performance Wing Project Lead. Hopper said the Air Force's CODE, or Combat Operations in Denied Environment, program determined that these types of missions could not be executed effectively by the large aircraft that we have been using over the last 20 years in areas where we have air dominance. Project Lysander was conceived as a method of rescuing isolated personnel in both heavily defended and undefended airspace. A critical element of the project was determined to be a carry-on kit that could allow such operations. Hopper said the Cubcrafter's Xcub was identified as the safest and most capable commercial off-the-shelf aircraft for the initial flying experiment to test the lash system. Quote, "If we can demonstrate that the Xcub can be flown safely at night at low speed and low altitude using the lash night vision aids, then we can expand lash system kit use to other types of short takeoff and landing GA aircraft." Hopper added that after the Xcub test aircraft has completed its role in this project, AFRL will be able to use it as a test asset for future research projects as well. From GeneralAviationNews.com, new COVID relief bill includes $45 million for GA airports. The latest COVID relief funding bill passed by Congress in late December and signed by the President December 27th includes about $2 billion in support for the nation's airports, including $45 million for GA airports. H.R. 133 also includes an additional $20 billion for the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, or EIDL program, which supports grants to small businesses experiencing temporary hardship and loss of revenue as a result of the pandemic. The package also provides an additional $15 billion in payroll support for air carriers, which also applies to many GA operators and businesses, and $284 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, loans for small businesses to continue to meet their payroll obligations. Selena Shalad, Executive Director of the Alliance for Aviation Across America, said, quote, "We welcome passage of this legislation, which supports businesses and communities that depend on GA at a time when they have been hit particularly hard by the global pandemic. We look forward to working with our partners and members of Congress to ensure that we continue to support GA and smaller airports, which are a critical part of our infrastructure, economy, and a lifeline for small businesses and rural communities around the country." General Aviation has been vital in distributing personal protection equipment, PPE, to hospitals and rural communities across the country, as well as test samples to labs and many other supplies to communities and patients in need. During the COVID-19 pandemic, general aviation traffic has been down more than 20% compared with the same period in 2019, Alliance officials noted. From NTSB.gov, accident involving inadequately trained pilot leads to call for better monitoring of flight instructors. Citing inadequate training of a pilot whose plane crash resulted in 11 deaths, the NTSB called on the FAA last week to better monitor the effectiveness of flight instructors. 3 safety recommendations have been issued during the NTSB's ongoing investigation of the June 21, 2019 Mokulea, Hawaii crash of an airplane on a parachute jump flight. The pilot and all 10 passengers died in the crash. In the safety recommendation report, the NTSB referenced the FAA's Aviation Instructor's Handbook, which states the goal of a flight instructor is to, quote, "to teach each learner in such a way that he or she will become a competent pilot." The NTSB said that in regard to the Mokulea accident pilot, the flight instructor did not achieve that goal. The NTSB found the Mokulea accident pilot had failed 3 initial flight tests in his attempts to obtain his private, instrument, and commercial pilot certificate after receiving instruction from a single instructor. The pilot subsequently passed each flight test. The Mokulea accident pilot was not alone in his failed attempts. The pass rate for other students taught by the same flight instructor was 59% for the 2-year period ending in April 2020. FAA data shows the average national pass rate for students of all flight instructors is 80%. The NTSB said substandard student pass rates may be indicative of a flight instructor who does not effectively teach the necessary skills associated with pilot certificates and ratings. The NTSB asked the FAA to develop a system to automatically alert its inspectors of flight instructors whose students' pass rates fall below 80%. Although a tracking system does exist to monitor pass rates, There currently is no automatic notification to an FAA inspector when a pass rate falls below the FAA established rate of 80% and becomes substandard. The FAA's stated practices on flight instructor surveillance are that substandard pass rates are indicative of instruction that needs to be more closely monitored so the FAA inspector can determine whether the instructor is providing adequate flight instruction. The NTSB found, however, that even with a substandard student pass rate, the Mukulea accident pilot's flight instructor was not receiving appropriate additional scrutiny. The NTSB also recommended that until a system that generates an automatic notification of flight instructor substandard pass rates is implemented, FAA inspectors should review flight instructors' pass rates on an ongoing basis to identify any in need of closer monitoring. The NTSB also asked the FAA to include substandard student pass rates as one of the criteria necessitating additional surveillance of a flight instructor. From justice.gov, that would be the U.S. Justice Department, Nebraska fugitive of 35 years and his spouse indicted on federal fraud charges. Now, this is a new way for a pilot to get in trouble, which I hadn't heard of before. The story says U.S. Attorney Maria Chapa Lopez announced the return of an indictment charging Howard Farley Jr., age 72, and Dukhan Thi Vu, 56, with passport fraud. Farley was also charged with aggravated identity theft, Social Security fraud, possession of a firearm and ammunition by a convicted felon, and operating as a pilot without a legitimate airman certificate. And I'll explain in a moment what's unusual about that charge. Vu was additionally charged with false statements to a federal agency and employing a pilot without a legitimate airman certificate. The indictment also includes a forfeiture allegation to seize the couple's aircraft. If convicted, Farley faces a maximum penalty of 30 years in federal prison. Vu faces a maximum penalty of 18 years in federal prison. Farley was previously arrested on December 2, 2020 as John Doe after federal agents obtained an arrest warrant for passport fraud. Once Farley was fingerprinted, agents confirmed that he had been using the identity of a deceased person for more than 35 years to avoid apprehension in the District of Nebraska, where in 1985 he had been indicted as part of a drug distribution conspiracy. Those charges were dismissed in 2014. According to the indictment and other court records, in or around February 2020, Farley and Vu, acting together, submitted a passport application using the name and date of birth of an infant who had died in 1955. Farley and Vu failed to disclose Farley's true identity in the application. They also included a Social Security number for the victim, which Farley had obtained by fraudulent means in 1982. At the time of his arrest on December 2nd, authorities executed a search warrant at the couple's residence, in which agents recovered a firearm and ammunition inside Farley's nightstand. Farley was convicted in 1970 of a felony in Nebraska and is prohibited from possessing a firearm or ammunition under federal law. While agents were at the residence, Vu allegedly made false statements regarding the true identity of Farley. The Department of Homeland Security also seized an aircraft located at the residence. While the aircraft was registered to Vu, Farley was the only pilot who operated it. The indictment charges Farley with operating as a pilot without a legitimate airman certificate. It further charges Vu with employing Farley as a pilot without a legitimate airman certificate. Farley did not have a legitimate airman certificate because he falsified his identity to the FAA. He also failed to disclose his felony conviction from Nebraska and his status as a fugitive from justice. If convicted of these offenses, the aircraft would be subject to forfeiture by the United States. And the story winds up by saying, an indictment is merely a formal charge that a defendant has committed one or more violations of federal criminal law, and every defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. From flyingmag.com, a story written by Rob Mark, will Amazon become the next UPS? Delivery giant purchases its first cargo jets. Amazon has become one of the wealthiest companies in the world thanks to its ability to deliver practically anything just about anywhere. That said, it shouldn't come as any great surprise that the delivery giant has finally taken the first leap toward creating its own fleet of aircraft. This past week, Amazon announced plans to purchase 11 Boeing 767-300s, 7 from Delta Airlines and 4 from Canadian WestJet. An Amazon spokesperson said the carrier believes the fleet will grow to more than 85 aircraft by the end of 2022. Until now, all of Amazon's aircraft flying under the Prime banner were leased. A January 5th Bloomberg story said, quote, as Amazon has built up its own delivery operation, which includes tens of thousands of cargo vans, the company has gone out of its way to highlight its continued reliance on other cargo companies. but Amazon already handles most of its own deliveries and has emerged as a competitor to partners that only a few years ago delivered almost all of the company's goods. FedEx Corporation in 2019 said it wouldn't renew its air delivery contract with Amazon. A report last year estimated that Amazon's fleet would likely grow to 200 aircraft in coming years, rivaling UPS in size. Sarah Rhodes, who's the VP of Amazon Global Air, said, quote, "Having a mix of both leased and owned aircraft in our growing fleet allows us to better manage our operations, which in turn helps us to keep pace in meeting our customer promises." And our final story comes from Bloomberg.com. FedEx is looking at using small self-flying cargo planes to serve remote areas after experimenting with a technology startup on autonomous aircraft, said Chief Executive Officer Fred Smith. The effort builds on the courier's work with Silicon Valley's Reliable Robotics. And to learn more, I went to the Reliable Robotics headquarters in Mountain View, California, and talked with Robert Rose. Robert is the co-founder of Reliable Robotics. He's a former senior director of autopilot at Tesla, and he led teams at SpaceX and Google's X division. And co-founder Jörg Freffel formerly worked at SpaceX and helped develop the Dragon spacecraft and the Falcon 9 rocket. Together, they believe that aircraft should fly themselves. And here is my conversation with Robert Rose. Well, Robert, welcome to Aviation News Talk. Thanks so much for giving me the tour of your offices here.
Thanks for stopping by.
So tell us how you got the idea originally for starting Reliable Robotics and about the company's mission.
So I'm one of these people, I would say I've had a lifelong interest in aviation, but didn't really act on it until later in life. My mom was a pilot. My father did aircraft maintenance. Two grandfathers were World War II pilots. I was involved in Civil Air Patrol when I was in college and took a little bit of flying lessons, but I figured out pretty quickly that that's an expensive hobby, and I think like many deferred it till I was an adult. So about 3.5 years ago, I decided to start taking flying lessons again. And this is, I'm working at Google at the time, and I had worked on self-driving cars and autonomous systems at SpaceX. And first thing I'm thinking when I get into the aircraft, taking flying lessons is, wow, this is incredibly complex, very workload intensive thing. How do we let people do this? And it hits me right after we land that, wow, this is crazy that we're going to have self-driving cars before self-flying planes. Why is that? And I didn't really initially think I was going to go start this company, but I started looking for answers to that question. And I think like many, I started out thinking there was already a very high degree of automation in aircraft that would make it sufficient for an aircraft to fly without a pilot. And in digging, realized that that's actually not the case. That systems are really good at identifying faults, but not necessarily handling them. And then we also have this problem with the regulations and discovering the regulatory basis for certifying these types of autonomous systems. So very, very long story short here. This resulted over the course of many months, conversations with friends and former colleagues from SpaceX about this topic. And it's just funny how the universe works. It turned out that they were exploring the similar sorts of questions that I was looking at. And in the end, we decided, hey, somebody needs to solve this problem. Somebody needs to figure out how do we get these aircraft flying on their own, and how do we do it in the U.S.? And so it was with that goal we founded Reliable Robotics.
And if you were to compare the problem of automating an airplane to fly itself with a self-driving car, which is more difficult and why maybe?
I think a self-driving car is orders of magnitude more challenging. I think you have an environment that's much more dynamic. You have events that occur where you need to respond in milliseconds. Whereas, and you have a highly unstructured dynamic environment that is constantly changing. Whereas in aviation, you almost have the complete opposite. You have operating rules for aircraft that are relatively well understood. You have environments like the airspace and airports where if you want to change them, you have to get the government involved many times in order to make changes. Just from many different angles, it's just a much more tractable problem. You also have one thing I personally think is really exciting is you also have the regulatory framework that enables you to put these types of systems in place. Whereas we're seeing a lot of delays in the rollout of self-driving cars because there isn't really much pre-existing regulatory basis there to do that type of thing.
You started out by automating a Cessna 172. You've now automated a Caravan 208. Let's talk about the Caravan. Tell us about some of the technology that's on board that aircraft.
So if you want the aircraft to fly itself, the first thing you need is to put all the systems on there that enable it to fly itself. So much like as you have an autopilot system today, we've developed a more advanced autopilot that has more capabilities. So we've developed software that allows you to specify a flight plan for not just the phases of flight, but also taxiing. It handles taxi, takeoff, landing, all the en route, etc. You need a flight computer that can process all of the inputs and outputs that you need to read across the aircraft. We've developed actuators. In the office tour, I was showing you some of our actuators that we've developed in-house. We had to develop those so that we can meet the torque output requirements to handle the aircraft through all phases of flight, and also to be able to disconnect and switch between actuators in the event of there being an issue with the actuator. Communication system, that's another system that we've had to add on. So we have dual redundant SATCOM, so the pilot in the remote control center can interact with and monitor the vehicle. Let's see, what am I leaving out? Oh, so in the control center, so we have offboard the aircraft, a room here I showed you where we have the ability for pilots to interact with the aircraft remotely. There's a whole back-end cloud infrastructure, data handling infrastructure that pipes the data back and forth between the control center and the aircraft. I think I just about covered everything.
Well, so the automation you're working on obviously changes the role of a pilot. Tell us about some of those changes. How is this going to affect pilots who are piloting these aircraft in the future? Yeah,
so you think about, so I'm a newly minted private pilot, so I learned about aviate, navigate, communicate. And when you think about what a pilot does versus what a pilot would do with our system's taking sort of the first half of that equation. It takes care of aviating the plane, keeping the wings level and getting the plane to where it needs to go. And it takes about half the navigation problem. So it tells you where the aircraft is and it follows the plan that you prescribed. Where the pilot steps in is in really... We want to harness what I think humans and pilots are best at. You know, people are really good at higher level decision making in complex new environments. One of the things I learned in training is focusing on increasing your margin and building margin into situations, constantly planning what you're going to be doing. That's hard when you're flying a plane. At the same time. And our system relieves you of that hands-on, well, you can't see this on the podcast, but I'm grabbing a yoke. It relieves you of needing to do that so that you, the human, can focus on what you're really good at. You can think about, okay, what would I do right now? What would I tell the aircraft to do if it reported a low fuel warning, for example? What am I going to say to air traffic control? How am I going to respond to the approach that air traffic is giving me? You can think about all these things in advance.
So at some point, these aircraft will be unmanned. The pilot will be in the control center here. What kinds of things will they have control of, and what will they do remotely from your control center?
So the way that we're building this system, step one, you're actually operating the plane from within the plane. And there's you can think of it as an FMS. So when you're sitting inside the plane, you're programming the flight plan, your taxi plan, et cetera, into this FMS. In the control center, you're doing the exact same thing. So picture, close your eyes and imagine for a moment someone who has, their EFB out in front of them, their charts, sectionals, et cetera. They've got their radio communication system, and then they've got the Reliable Robotics flight management system sitting in front of them. And so they're focused on the operation at hand, and other than that, everything else works exactly the same as it would in a plane.
Okay, so the pilot in your control center is talking through a satellite to ATC through the radio in the airplane.
Correct.
Tell us about how you think this is going to affect cargo airlines and consumers. What are the benefits of the products and services that you're developing?
Yeah, so this is where I get really excited. The way, e-commerce obviously has exploded in the last couple of months, or over the last year, I should say. Demand is not anticipated to subside anytime soon. So all the predictions I've been seeing is that this is going to sustain and in fact just continue to increase over the coming years. People want to get their goods faster. The reality is to do that, in a cost-efficient way, you need an air transportation system that is much more dynamic. And the way that aircraft are moved today with pilots, you have to deal with all of the issues of scheduling and accommodating pilots and crew rest rules and all of these issues combined, and ultimately drive up the cost and complexity of your operation. By moving the pilot into the control center, it allows us to realize a whole bunch of efficiencies around how you schedule these planes. It allows you also to upgauge and downgauge an aircraft dynamically. Pilots typically, especially in commercial environments, only fly one, maybe two different types of aircraft. With our system, the differences between different types of aircraft are greatly minimized. So you could potentially be flying Cessna Caravan one day, and then you turn around and you fly, say, a jet freighter the next day. So that's one. This also, for a large cargo carrier, gives them a much more direct, I'm a software engineer, so it gives you an API basically to reposition the plane. And for a major air cargo company, this is where this technology becomes a game changer for them, because today they have to schedule these flights days, weeks, sometimes months in advance, and they're on completely fixed schedules. Whereas if the aircraft flies itself and is remotely operated, you can dynamically reposition these planes. You can move them around the country to respond to weather events, demand surges, etc.
I guess ultimately you can probably increase the utilization of the aircraft, because you could be flying it far more hours during a day than pilots might be able to do that.
Oh, definitely. So
tell me a little bit about the certification issues.
So it's more than what goes on the aircraft. If you want to fly a plane for revenue in the U.S., it's more than just the Part 23, Part 25 aircraft certification or the Part 91 pilot operating certification, et cetera. If you want to fly for revenue, you also need to be thinking about 121 or 135. There's also what's unique with UAS or unmanned aircraft. You have to be thinking about the communication system and the back-end data network and the certification of that. So what we're doing here is we're tying together not just the systems that go on the plane, but also the certification of the communication stack, the certification of the back-end data handling system, as well as the ops spec for the company that runs the plane, which includes maintenance procedures for the unmanned aircraft, pilot training procedures, things of that nature.
So I went on your website and I saw you have a lot of job openings. Tell me about the kind of people you're looking to hire here at Reliable Robotics.
Yeah, I want to encourage anybody who's interested to go to the website and check out all the job openings. To hit some of the major ones, I mean, we're developing software, we're developing avionics hardware, we're developing flight control algorithms, mechanical interfaces. We need folks that know how to integrate large, complex vehicle systems. We're looking also for folks who've done Part 23 and Part 25 certification. It's really everything you think you would need to do something like this, we're hiring for.
And those are primarily for jobs here in Silicon Valley, Mountain View, California?
Well, actually, we've always been a remote-first company. Even pre-COVID, about a quarter of the company worked remote. We've got folks in SoCal, Florida, the UK, even France. We go where the talent is. So, and COVID, I think, has just made that even easier for us to grab people from different parts of the world. So, although a lot of the work is based in Mountain View, a lot of the physical integration is here, many of our roles don't require you to relocate.
Well, Robert, thanks so much for taking time today to talk with us at Aviation News Talk.
Thank you.
And after that visit to their headquarters, I met up again with Robert on Saturday at the San Martin Airport, where he opened up their Cessna 172 and Cessna 208 so I could see everything they've added to those aircraft to make them self-flying. And as an electrical engineer, I was in heaven. Here's a brief part of that conversation we had in the 172 hangar. What was the time period it took from start to finish to actually get this reliable?
Yeah. So walking through the whole trajectory here. So we got this aircraft January of 2018 and started cutting into it that month. In February, we did our first in-flight tests with our first flight computer and our first actuation system, the one that was in the wing that I mentioned. So we had a basic 2-axis autopilot running in February and March of that year. So that was within a month or two. We did landings at altitudes initially, so we had 3 or 4 days of flight tests where we were just tuning in, getting the glide path following and flare correct at 2,000 feet AGL. And then eventually we brought it in down, and yeah, the idea was it should do the same thing it did at 2,000 feet as it did, or on the ground as it did at 2,000 feet. And we got it to land. Then we did the braking system, and then that was December of that year. So within 12 months, we had the thing doing fully automated gate-to-gate operation. And then finally, it was a cool day in September. We decided we were ready to go and have our test pilot step out of the plane and let the thing go on its own. And it was completely uneventful because we had just been stressing out for the last 9 months about failure cases. And when the thing actually worked, we were just looking at each other like, well, that was boring. And then we realized, wait, it's supposed to be boring. This is good. Boring is good.
Yeah, that's my favorite kind of flying. Things are boring.
Mm-hmm.
And my thanks to Robert Rose for spending time with me and hosting me at Reliable Robotics. If you want to learn more about the company, you can find them on the web at reliable.co. Coming up next, a few of my updates, followed by our pilot skills topic, and then a safety focus with Rob Mark. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now here's a fun flying destination from Patreon supporter Paras Trivedi.
Hi Max, this is Paras Trivedi from Bay Area. I'd like to share with your listeners a very unique set of fun flying destinations. Let me start with Kauai, Hawaii. That's right, the main airport Lihue at the Kauai island of Hawaii. Technically, it's not the fun flying destination that you would fly to from your home airport on the mainland. But if you are there on vacation, you can certainly enjoy flying around the island as a GA pilot. Several years ago, when I was there on family vacation, I contacted Bruce at Wings Over Kauai at the main airport, and the owner-operator Bruce is a CFI. I had a great dual instruction and sightseeing flight for about 1 hour around the beautiful island in a Cessna 172. They also have a 6-seater GA8 Airvan aircraft that you can rent with the instructor. It's an amazing way to add logbook entry for an airport in Hawaii and get some sightseeing at the same time. The cost was about the same as a sightseeing flight for the non-pilots out there. So thanks for a great podcast. And thanks for all the goodies for the Patreon supporters.
Paras, thanks so much for supporting us via Patreon and for taking the time to record that fun flying destination. And if you have a favorite destination, please share it with all of us here. Easy to do. Just go ahead and write up about 90 seconds about your favorite airport, and then go ahead and take your smartphone, look for your voice memos app, record that 90 seconds, and then email it to me here at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. Or if you want, if you've got a microphone on your computer, just go out onto the web to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Question. That'll take you to the SpeakPipe app where you can then record up to 90 seconds, and that will automatically email that file to me right here. And I mentioned to you last week that I had been going through the aviation books left behind by my good friend Ron Carmichael, who passed away last year. And in it, I found another one of my favorite books. Thought I would mention it to you. If you have any interest in learning to fly a tail dragger, or if you want to know even more about tail draggers than you already know, I recommend The Complete Tail Dragger Pilot. Now, complete is spelled in a non-standard way. It's COMPLEAT. So it's The Complete Tail Dragger Pilot. Years ago, when I was getting checked out in the first tail dragger that I ever flew, I remember the first 1 or 2 lessons were pretty wild. In that I had a little difficulty controlling the airplane, especially on the ground during takeoff and sometimes during landing. I ordered this book, or actually I think I found it in the local pilot shop. I read it before my next lesson, which I think was my 3rd lesson, And it really helped me understand all the different dynamics that were going on the ground and how the amount of rudder pressure varied considerably multiple times throughout the takeoff process. And I remember on that very next flight, I absolutely nailed my first takeoff, and my instructor looked at me in astonishment. And I told him that I had read this book and that it helped considerably. So I've got a link for it in the show notes if you'd like to order it from Amazon. It's got a yellow cover. It's about 20 years old now, but I think you're going to find everything in there is still totally relevant. That's The Complete Taildragger Pilot. And let me briefly mention an article about the National Weather Service Doppler radar here in the United States. As a pilot, you probably should be interested in everything you can learn about these. It says, Weather Service tells Congress radar gaps don't hurt accuracy, but outside scientists disagree. It says one of the most reliable and costly tools at a meteorologist's disposal for issuing watches and warnings is a network of 159 Doppler radars across the country that provide detailed views inside storms. But as capable as the U.S. radar network is, gaps in coverage have drawn consistent complaints from meteorologists and lawmakers frustrated by unwarned of severe weather. They say an overdue report to Congress from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which operates the National Weather Service, attempts to quantify the impacts of such gaps on warning performance. Their results downplay the significance of the gaps, counter to the experience of some public and private sector meteorologists. And they give an example here. They talk about the Charlotte metro area served by a Doppler radar 80 miles away in Greer, South Carolina, and the radar beam intersects clouds at about 5,000 feet or more above the city, missing some of the most important low-level weather features that can determine whether a storm will spawn a tornado. During the winter, some snow and ice events can take place largely below the height of the beam. By the way, the same thing happens in Santa Rosa, California, which is 80 miles north of where the National Weather Service radar is located in San Jose, California, and it's located on a mountaintop at 3,600 feet. And so historically, its radar beam can't detect anything below about 10,000 feet over Santa Rosa, meaning that low-level storms go undetected at times. So it's an interesting article, and you might ask, how do these gaps apply to pilots? Well, if you have an in-cockpit display for next-rad weather, such as you might receive from Sirius XM or from ADSB, you may have noticed on your weather display some lightly shaded gray semicircles, particularly in the western part of the U.S. These represent areas where there is no next-rad radar coverage because of gaps in coverage areas between adjacent Doppler radar stations on the ground. So one time I was flying VFR in Wyoming using next-rad radar to avoid some of the widely scattered rain, and I noticed there was no precipitation south of me in Colorado, so I headed that way. And at some point I spotted the Rocky Mountains and realized the reason there was no precipitation displayed was because there was no Doppler radar coverage in that part of Colorado, which is why my next-rad radar display couldn't show me the precipitation that actually was occurring in those mountains. So I'll provide a link to this article in the show notes, and of course you can always find the show notes either in whatever app you're listening to or by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/173. And here's a question for you. What does an hour of flight instruction or an hour of ground instruction cost you? And I'm sure the amount varies depending upon where you're located, but you probably have a number in your mind. But perhaps a better question is, how much is that hour of flight instruction worth to you, especially if you maybe learn something that could someday save your life? Really kind of priceless, isn't it? So please keep that in mind as you think about this show. Is it providing you value? Is it providing you the same kind of value you might get from an hour of flight instruction? And if you feel like you're getting that kind of value from the show, please sign up today to support the show. It's really easy to do that. If you'd like to make a monthly donation, you can go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, which takes you to our Patreon site where you can sign up at different dollar levels. For example, at the $8 level a month, you'll get our show notes plus a list of all the stories that didn't make it into the show. So, for example, this week I have 7 news stories that didn't make it into the news segment of the show because of time limitations. At the $20 a month level, you will sometimes get these shows early. So, for example, this week, our $20 and up Patreon supporters got this episode a full day before everybody else got the show. And at the $35 a month level, you get free access to my online courses at pilotlearning.com. And of course, we have a lot of mega supporters that support us at the $50 level and above. And we have a new one. That would be Ed Kelly. Ed flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. He and I talked on the phone recently, and he says that his 2-year-old son Bennett is the best co-pilot that he could possibly have. We also have a new mega supporter, Jeff Brausch, who I haven't spoken with yet, but I'll tell you more about him next week. And if you'd prefer to make a one-time lump sum donation, you can easily do that through PayPal. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, and you can either put in a one-time donation or a monthly amount that'll get billed to your credit card each month. And I want to thank the 5 new people who've signed up via Patreon the last week or so. They include Tom Dooner, Heather Cole, who signed up at the $20 a month level, Richard Blamer, also $20 a month, so both of them are hearing this show early. Mark, I don't have a last name for you, Mark, but thanks for your donation. And also Peter DeVries. And coming up next, our skills topic, all about instrument departures and ODPs, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's talk more about IFR departures and ODPs. This is a follow-up to episode 166, in which I talked about a number of instrument flying gotchas. So if you haven't heard that episode, you may want to check it out. Also in episode 167, I answered a question from a NorCal controller about how pilots climb on an IFR clearance when there's no ODP, and I wanted to add some additional detail to that answer. First, let's do a little review of ODPs, or obstacle departure procedures. If you look at an overall hierarchy, departure procedures is the name for the umbrella that covers all of the published ways to depart an airport IFR. Below that, there are 2 major subcategories. One is SIDs, SIDs, or Standard Instrument Departure Procedures. Most of those are graphical depictions of how you can depart an airport when flying IFR. Many but not all SIDs are available in the databases of IFR-capable GPSs, and you can load them directly from a database into your flight plan. The other subcategory is obstacle departure procedures. These are textual descriptions of other procedures for departing from some airports' IFR. Most of these are not included in the database of IFR-capable GPSs, so there is no easy way to load them directly into a flight plan. In some cases, though, you can manually enter one or more steps of an ODP into your GPS, though in some cases, you may need to use the GPS's OBS mode, which is beyond the scope of our discussion today. But if you want a really detailed discussion of OBS mode, I would refer you to either my Max Truscot's G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook or my Max Truscot's GPS and WAS Instrument Flying Handbook, and you can order either or both of those at 800-247-6553. Now, if you're flying Part 135 Charter or Part 121 Airlines, and there's an ODP published for an airport, you are required to use that ODP unless you've been assigned another departure procedure. However, most GA pilots fly under Part 91, and there is no requirement for Part 91 pilots to use an ODP published for an airport. However, flying a published ODP when one is available makes a lot of sense, since the FAA has already done a lot of work to assure that the ODP will keep you out of the rocks. So if an ODP is available, I strongly encourage you to use it unless ATC has assigned you a different departure procedure. By the way, when you file a flight plan, you can always make a note in the remarks sections that you'll be using a particular ODP and what runway you'll be departing from. ODPs can be flown without an ATC clearance unless an alternate departure procedure such as a SID or radar vectors has been specifically assigned by ATC. ODPs are only published at airports that have at least one instrument approach, but not all airports with instrument approaches have ODPs, and here's why. When the FAA analyzes an airport for an instrument approach procedure, it also performs an obstacle departure procedure, an ODP assessment. Essentially, they assume that on departure, a pilot will cross the departure end of the runway at least 35 feet above the runway, and then continue climbing straight ahead at 200 feet per nautical mile until they are 400 feet above the departure end of the runway. From there, the pilot can turn in any direction. Below this 200 foot per nautical mile path flown by an airplane is an imaginary surface called the OCS, or Obstacle Clearance Surface, which rises at a slower rate. It rises at 152 feet per nautical mile, and no obstacles are allowed to penetrate this surface. So essentially, as an IFR aircraft departs while climbing at 200 feet per nautical mile, it gains 48 feet of additional obstacle clearance for every mile it flies. The FAA then looks to see if the pilot can safely continue in any direction while continuing to climb at 200 feet per nautical mile, out to 25 nautical miles in non-mountainous areas and 46 nautical miles in mountainous areas. Essentially, the FAA is evaluating a cone of safety, and if no obstacles penetrate the OCS, a pilot is safe as long as they can maintain a climb of 200 feet per nautical mile. At airports where no objects penetrate the OCS, the FAA will not create an ODP for an airport. So if you live in a relatively flat area and you look at nearby airports in the Airport Facility Directory, the AFD, which is now, by the way, called the Chart Supplement, you might not find any published ODPs. But in mountainous states like here in California, many airports have ODPs. So if you live in a flat area and you're departing from an airport that has at least one instrument approach and there is no ODP published for your airport, you can perform what's known as a diverse departure. Essentially, as long as you cross the departure end of the airport at 35 feet above the runway, and you continue flying runway heading until you reach 400 feet above the elevation of the departure end of the runway, you can then safely turn in any direction as long as you climb the entire time at a rate of at least 200 feet per nautical mile. By the way, when the FAA does an obstacle departure procedure assessment, if they find that an obstacle does penetrate the OCS, the obstacle clearance surface, then they have a few options. They can specify in the takeoff minimums a climb rate that's higher than the standard 200 feet per nautical mile climb rate, or they could also create an ODP. And when an ODP has been developed solely for obstacle avoidance, you'll find the symbol T on instrument approach procedure charts and departure procedure charts for that airport. That tells you that you should look at the Airport Facility Directory, the chart supplement, for the textual description of the ODP. And while you're looking at the chart supplement, also look to see if the takeoff minimums mention a cloud ceiling and visibility minimum. If there is one, there's a good chance that was added to allow you to see and avoid obstacles that are close into the airport. Now let's talk about airports that don't have any instrument procedures at all. At these airports, no obstacle departure procedure assessment will have been performed. Hence, there won't be an ODP, and you won't be able to do a diverse departure. As I mentioned back in episode 167, what I was taught was that a pilot is responsible for using sectional charts and other resources to determine a safe path to climb while climbing up to the MEA. Circling up over the airport would probably be a good solution in areas with challenging terrain. Doing that is perfectly legal, but as we often discuss on this show, you want to be both legal and safe. And I recently came across an article in IFR magazine written by Mark Kolber. Now, I've known Mark for nearly 20 years, and he is not only an extremely knowledgeable CFI, but he's also a lawyer. The question Mark posed in that article was, can you legally and safely depart from a Class G airport with no instrument procedures when the weather is below visual conditions? And he said the answer is, it depends. Now, let me quote now from Mark's article in IFR magazine. In April 2015, the FAA Chief Counsel's Office responded to an inquiry from Dave Wyman, president of Flyer Publications, positing the scenario being discussed here, a departure from an airport with no instrument approach, and a terrain and obstruction query from ATC. Now, just to clarify, I think what Mark meant here when he refers to an ATC query is when ATC says something like, are you able to provide your own terrain and obstacle clearance between your present altitude and 3,000 feet or whatever altitude gets you up to the minimum vectoring altitude. If you're in VMC and can stay in VMC all the way up to that altitude, then your answer will probably be yes, as you'll be able to see the surrounding terrain. Where things get murky, and I think this is what Mark is referring to, is when you'll need to enter the clouds before you reach that altitude, 3,000 feet in my example. Then, of course, it's going to be hard to be 100% sure that you can maintain terrain and obstruction clearance all the way up to that altitude because you can no longer see outside. Now, getting back to Mark's article, Wyman asked whether it was safe and legal for a pilot to accept responsibility for obstacle clearance when he cannot see obstacles on the ground, but could likely avoid obstacles due to his or her knowledge of the area or charts. The response is telling. No reference to any regulation prohibiting the practice appears. Instead, pointing to the 91.13 catch-all regulation, the letter warns it may be deemed careless and reckless to answer yes to ATC's query based only on the likely ability to avoid obstacles. And this, by the way, is if you're departing with an IFR clearance. Mark continues, terrain doesn't move much, but obstructions come and go. The official obstruction database has structures over 200 feet AGL and even lower in the vicinity of airports with approach procedures. Even then, the database depends on timely reporting of new obstructions. He concludes, ultimately, this is about personal risk tolerance. If we roll our own, that is, if we create our own departure procedure, we'd better be right, with a regulation bus being our least concern if we're wrong. Obviously, the concern would be you might kill yourself. I followed up with Mark via email for some further clarification. In the FAA Chief Counsel's letter, he referred to the scenario cited was that it was likely that the pilot could avoid obstacles. I wrote, yet if a pilot flew in visually the day before, knew the area well, had an updated G1000 or other GPS with terrain and obstruction databases, I would think he or she could be certain they would avoid terrain and obstacles, though, yes, a 200-foot tower could have been erected overnight. What's your view on this? Mark replied, likely to avoid obstacles was in the question asked of the Chief Counsel in the interpretation I cited, but I don't think the pilot being sure makes any difference. As I said in the article, the interpretation doesn't point to any specific regulation prohibiting rolling your own departure. It only points out the risk that it may be considered careless and reckless under FAR 91.13. That puts it into a very large category of practices which are not prohibited, but may form the basis for a 91.13 violation. The article mentions one, departing IFR in the clouds from a Class G airport with no clearance, expecting to reach VFR conditions before entering Class C. Perfectly legal, but pilots doing that have been violated for creating an unacceptable risk to others. Another example is the straight-in approach to a non-towered airport in VFR conditions. Perfectly legal, unless you cause a problem by interfering with those flying a normal pattern. I don't think pilots subjectively believing their path to the MEA is clear automatically removes the risk of being violated for being reckless. Like many others in the it's legal but is it safe category, the most favorable yes you can answer is it is not highly likely to result in enforcement unless it causes a problem which leads the FAA to investigate. Better not scare those chickens while still low over the nearby farm or pop up on radar where ATC least expects you to be. At that point, all bets are off. Each situation will be judged on its own facts, and no one said I couldn't is not the best defense. Well, I hope you found that useful. If you're looking to learn even more about the underlying details of how instrument approaches and departure procedures are designed, I recommend my Max Truscott's GPS and WAAS Instrument Flying Handbook, and I'll include a link in the show notes so that you can order it from me online. And you can find the show notes at aviationnewstalk.com/173 for episode 173. Coming up next, our safety-focused conversation with Rob Mark on sterile cockpits for general aviation. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Hey, it's time for another Aviation News Talk safety focus, and who better to share the mic than flying senior editor Rob Mark. Rob's career experience includes years as an air traffic controller, a CFI, a corporate charter and airline pilot, and an award-winning journalist, and of course, publisher of the long-running industry blog Jetwine. Rob, welcome back to the show.
Hey, it's nice to be back, Max. Thank you very much for inviting me today. And it's early in 2021, isn't it?
It is, just after the new year. Well, today we're going to talk about the sterile cockpit rule and how general aviation pilots can apply it to their day-to-day flying, whether they fly for fun or a flight instructor or even as a corporate pilot. And I think that a lot of pilots know that these rules right now as written only apply to charter pilots and airline pilots, but there are ways that we can adapt them and use them because they're just as important to GA flying as they are to airline flying.
I think that's true. And of course, I think many of the people that are listening might not even know what the sterile cockpit rule is. Let me just read something that talks about the sterile cockpit rule. It speaks to the critical phase of flight. That's when we're going to try to implement the sterile cockpit rule, and I'll define that in a minute. All ground operations involving taxi, takeoff, landing, and other flight ops below 10,000 feet MSL, except when you're in cruise. And the sterile cockpit part means no extraneous chatter, no busy work, no cleaning up the cockpit, no fussing with anything that doesn't have to do with flying the airplane safely. And you'll notice that it starts essentially the moment you start the engine, and it doesn't quit until you shut down at the other end. And that's because there are so many things that people don't realize that can get in the way of your flying that can cause an accident or an incident. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and I think the ground operation portion is incredibly important. I run into GA pilots all the time who just do not treat taxiing and ground operations as if they're actually part of flying. You see that on the ground. They're doing all kinds of other things when they should be focused only on taxiing. I see it after they land where they totally relax and they stop paying attention and doing things correctly because they think, hey, I'm done with the hard part. It's just now getting back to, taxiing. And yet, so many things happen, incidents where people, bend metal and bend airplanes. So yes, it's just as critical on the ground to be focused on what you're flying and not have idle chatter.
Well, and I think it's important, too, that we mention this can happen to anybody. We're going to give people some general aviation examples today, but we're also going to talk about some examples of, sterile cockpit rule breaking that affected people at the airlines. And I think that I don't want people to say, oh, well, that's just the airlines. I don't have to worry about that. The same thing can happen to you. In fact, let me just really mention something because this one's near and dear to my heart because I reported on it. But Comair 5191, which was a CRJ that took off from Lexington, Kentucky in 2001. And the crew, it was early morning. The crew was chatting as they taxied out. They'd done this run a number of times. And instead of the long runway, they taxied to a short runway at Lexington by mistake, because they just weren't paying attention, and they took off. And most incredibly, they took off on a runway that had no runway lights on it. And that is like a cardinal clue to pilots that if they clear you to take off at night on a runway with no runway lights, you need to stop and say, hey, tower, are you sure this is the runway? Anyway, they took off. They didn't get the CRJ airborne because there was only 4,000 feet of runway. It crashed. It killed a bunch of people. And what's even sadder is that I think that the tower controller deserved some of the responsibility for this, although the NTSB didn't mention it. And the reason is that when I was a controller, they always taught you, especially if you were in the tower by yourself, when you taxi somebody to a runway before you clear them for takeoff, you make sure that they are where they're supposed to be, but you also never take your eyes off an airplane when you clear them for takeoff. And apparently this guy cleared him for takeoff and turned his back on the runway and went off to doing some other things. And if he had been paying attention also, he might have noticed Comair was taking off on the wrong runway and he might have been able to stop them, but he wasn't. So again, this is the whole thing. It's people doing things that at the wrong time that they don't think are any big deal, and they really are.
And there's a very simple check that crew could have done, which is the runway check. And I recommend anytime someone pulls out onto a runway, if you've been cleared for, in that case, I believe was runway 25 or 26, you should look at either your HSI, your compass, verify that the numbers on that HSI or compass matches the runway number. They ended up taking off on runway 22, and it was an easy mistake to make because both runways started at approximately the same point. Now, we started the conversation talking about how sterile cockpit applies on the ground. It also applies anytime the airline crew is below 10,000 feet. Talk a little bit more about what sterile cockpit means in terms of what you can do and what you can't do.
Well, sterile cockpit essentially means that once you get down to 10,000 MSL, it's a matter of paying attention to the approach. That's where your mind is focused. You're getting ready to brief the approach if it's IFR, or brief a visual approach if that's where you're headed. You're looking more intensely for traffic because that's where a lot of the small airplanes are. But again, it's about only being involved in operations that actually affect the approach and landing of that airplane. Is in one of the examples you showed me earlier, somebody was cleaning up the cockpit. He was flying single pilot, and that's the worst one. And that's why so much of this really does apply to GA pilots, because somebody says, well, I'm in my Cirrus and it's on autopilot and I'm fine. So I got to get rid of these extra. I had my lunch here. Let me wrap up my bag and get my pen out because I'm going to need that. And I'll put this extra headset away. And they're not paying attention to what the airplane is doing. At that point in time, they're not flying the airplane. Something's flying the airplane, maybe the autopilot. In some of these examples we're going to talk about today, the autopilot kicked off and the airplane was, I don't know who was flying, and the crew didn't notice it. But it can happen to you, and you're 182. So you don't clean up the cockpit. You don't do anything that doesn't specifically involve getting the ATIS, making sure you're looking at the proper approach plate, whether it's on the MFD or on your iPad, or even if I guess there are people that still have paper ones. But again, so that you are prepared to shoot the approach, you're setting up your nav instruments to make sure all the frequencies jive, and nothing else, absolutely nothing else. And why this is really important is that so many of us carry people in the right seat. And often people that are just so enamored with flying that they just think it's so cool, especially if you're flying in the clouds, but they can be very distracting. And that's when you need to say, hopefully you've done this before you even start the engine. You say, look, we've got to talk for a minute about when it's okay to talk and when it's not okay to talk. Once I start the engine and I'm getting the radio work done, please do not talk. Listen, but do not talk. If you have a question, save it until we're safely airborne and out of the area, or the same thing in reverse. If we're coming in and I go, hey, sterile cockpit, whatever the signal is, or you say it, please, no talking, no questions, unless it's something that you think is critical, like, hey, I think I smell smoke in the cockpit, or I see an airplane out of the right side. That's critical, but nothing else is. And we as the PIC need to be PIC-ish enough to say, shut up, please, because I'm going to make a mistake. And it's not just about saying it's not safe. That doesn't mean anything to someone that doesn't fly. But if you tell them, look, being distracted by you could cause me to make a very significant mistake that could hurt us, and I don't want to do that. We'll see. Maybe you've got one of these. In fact, there were a bunch of examples that I pulled down off the ASRS database from NASA in which people forgot to put the gear down. How many gear ups were in that dozen I said? I think 4 or 5, because people got distracted. They got out of the sequence of their checklists, however they did them, whether they're printed or they were memorized, but they got out of the sequence and they forgot to put the gear down.
Let me touch on a couple of the points you brought up there. For the airlines, for Part 135 and 121, there's a very long list of things that you cannot do when you're in these critical phases of flight, including, for example, eating. You're not allowed to be having a meal. You have to be focused solely on activities related to flying the airplane. Can't be distracted by idle chatter. And then, of course, the 10,000-foot rule, that doesn't really help a whole lot for general aviation, because I would say most GA pilots spend most of their time below 10,000 feet. There are going to be many flights where they're never above 10,000 feet. And so GA pilots really need to come up with different criteria so that they could create their own version of the sterile cockpit rule. What I tell people is that rather than 10,000 feet, think of having a sterile cockpit either when you're within 10 miles of the airport, or within 10 minutes of the airport. Either of those will help you and your passengers understand that, hey, it's game time now. This is where we have to get extremely serious, where distractions can cause much bigger problems than they might cause in other phases of flight. And I agree that time to set the tone for that is in the passenger briefing, which pilots are required to give. So when you brief passengers, the FAA requires you to talk about, at a minimum, how to operate the seatbelts, how to operate the door. I always teach my clients that they also, among other things that we need to include in the briefing, have to talk about talking. I tell them to keep chatter to a minimum when we're in the vicinity of the airport, especially when I'm taking off and landing, unless you see something related to the safety of the flight. That could be another airplane, headed toward us, for example. But then in terms of passenger distractions, I can remember years ago before I became a flight instructor, taking my favorite passenger used to be my mother. Mom loved flying so much. And I remember landing at Palo Alto, my home airport, one time where she was just chattering away the entire time I was on final, all the way to the ground. And of course, being the good son, I didn't say, Mom, you got to shut up. Of course, maybe I didn't brief her properly back, in those days, many years ago. But pilot in command means that you have to take charge, you have to take responsibility, you have to set the tone, the environment for everybody in the aircraft. So that's why that briefing is so important. Another example, I can remember a couple of clients that I've had, student pilots, one in particular, who just had kind of a nervous habit of talking all the time just to fill space. And even when we were in the pattern, as he's, making his turn to base and making turn to file, he would just be, yammering on about whatever was crossing his mind. And I had to tell him, you've just got to stop talking so you can focus on what you're doing.
And that's hard for people because this is pretty cool. I mean, flying is pretty cool and people get really jazzed about it when they're out there, and nobody wants to be the one to say, look, I'm sorry, you're taxiing and you put the brakes on for a minute. You go, look, you have got to stop talking because I'm going to make a mistake. I had a situation years ago where I was in a jet and I was in the right seat, that leg. We were both co-captains, and the other guy's cell phone rang. We were, where did I say we were?
San Jose, I believe.
Thank you. We were taxiing out for departure in San Jose, and we're just leaving the gate. And this was in a 650 Citation, so he had to work the throttles, the rudders, and he had a tiller on the left side for the nose wheel. And so his cell phone rings, and it never crossed my mind that he was going to pick it up, but he did. And I thought, wow, he's picking up the cell phone, and I'm working the radios, and I'm thinking, oh, okay, and he's talking to the boss on the cell phone, and I'm trying to do hand signals to say, okay, we got to go down this taxiway, and all these going, and we get towards the end of the runway, and I finally, when we stopped the airplane, I said, Dave, you got to get off the phone. And so Tower said, are you guys ready? And I said, well, give us about 30 seconds here, because we had not briefed the SID, which at that time, I forgot we were taking off to the northwest, I think, or north at San Jose. And it was kind of a complicated, straight out with a right turn. You get to a point and then you either brake right or brake left or
that's the Loop 5 departure, which is pretty common. You climb out straight ahead to 5,000 and then you make a right turn 180 degrees and then you make another 180, cross the VOR at 12,000 feet, and then you're on to your destination.
That's it. And so when Tower said, are you ready? And I said, give us 30 seconds. And he said, no, let's go. We're ready. And I said, but we haven't even talked about that. He said, go. I went, okay, and I was complicit in this too. And we took off and broke ground. And we knew there was a right turn to whatever the turn was. And we got to this point where we were supposed to do either a left turn or a right turn to go on course. And he said, which way do I go? I went, I don't know. I'm looking at the plate, and he says, well, I'm going left. And guess what? That was the wrong way. And we're on that course for maybe 10 or 15 seconds. And San Jose departure says, hey, 250 Charlie Mike, where are you going? And those are the famous words you don't want to hear from controllers. And so they gave us a phone number to call, and we had to call them when we got back. And we almost got our license suspended because one of us should have been in charge enough to say, no, this has got to stop. But, those are the kinds of lessons. Luckily, no one was killed or injured. Our pride was bruised, but it could have been a whole lot worse. And again, it was a stupid thing to do. And you could see it building up to a significant error. And that's how all of this stuff happens.
Yeah, and I think that one key thing to take away from that is I think it's easy for you as a co-pilot perhaps to defer to the captain And yet co-pilots need to step up when they see things that are not right. And talking on your cell phone while taxiing an airplane is just a brutal violation of the sterile cockpit rule. And of course, you were, I guess, Part 135. Was that a charter operation?
No, that was a 91 operation.
91. So technically, those rules didn't apply to you, but it's easy to see how they got you in trouble because you weren't fully prepared to fly the departure procedure. Well, there's an article I ran across that says an internal audit of NASA reports from the ASRS found that 56% of all sterile cockpit violations involved extraneous conversation. I'm surprised it's not higher than that, frankly. The same report went on to analyze sterile cockpit deviations in airline operations, and they noted the following problems were attributed to failure to follow a sterile cockpit. Almost half of them were altitude deviations, so people leveled off at the wrong altitude. 14% were course deviations. This one really bothers me. 14% were runway transgressions. That means that an airliner taxied onto either a runway or the wrong runway without permission. I mean, that really emphasizes how important the sterile cockpit is on the ground. You have to pay attention to all of these details because you could get people killed if you don't. Another 14% were general distractions with no specific adverse consequence. 8% involved takeoffs or landings without clearance. Now, again, this is airline operations. Failure to follow sterile cockpit led to takeoffs and landings without a clearance. 2% involved near midair collisions. So that's just the airlines. And of course, with the airlines, you've got two pilots who fly professionally day in and day out, at least with the two-pilot crew. Hopefully the second person is going to speak up and say, oops, we shouldn't be doing that right now. But in general aviation with a single pilot, there's no one to remind the pilot, hey, you shouldn't be talking with the passengers right now.
I think that's a really important point. And people say, well, if I had a second pilot, man, life would be sweet because I wouldn't have to worry about anything anymore. And trust me, it doesn't work that way. And there have been many accidents when there were three pilots in the airplane. And so going back to the single pilot part, I think it's really, really important that we emphasize, forget what you call it. Maybe you don't call it the sterile cockpit rule. Maybe you call it the shut up while we're taxiing and shut up after we're landing and shut up while we're on approach situation. And there's one here I saw in a Piper PA-46, but somewhere out on the East Coast, and the guy had a passenger that was very chatty in the right seat. He also had his mom in the airplane, and she wasn't feeling well. So there are already distractions galore in this flight. And unfortunately, the pilot didn't seem to have enough of that to tell people to be quiet. And he programmed the wrong fix in the flight management system. And he got one of those, hey, 9-6 Golf, where are you going? Because he didn't realize it and because he wasn't paying attention. And again, single pilot, I'm surprised actually that FAA, being as safety focused as they are, hasn't figured out a way to put some sort of rule like sterile cockpit in effect for GA pilots to emphasize the seriousness of this problem, which is, of course, why we're talking about it today.
Well, of course, this is the perfect time for New Year's resolutions. So I would say that anyone's listening, if you are not enforcing a sterile cockpit in your cockpit, regardless of what kind of pilot you are, what kind of flying you do, this is something that you really ought to add to your normal protocol because it's something I think that private pilots often overlook as being important. It's easy when you have friends in the airplane to be enjoying the good times together and to be idly chatting, and yet history is replete with accidents and problems that have been caused by people failing to maintain a sterile cockpit.
I think it's also important to realize that when you're by yourself, especially if you're at an airport and you're taxiing either out to the runway or back in, and you have passengers that have been maybe a little chatty, and you're coming up on a runway, and you think they cleared me across that runway. Did they clear? I'm sure he did. Yeah. If you even think about that, stop the airplane and say, Did you clear 50 Charlie Mike across runway 32? Or verify that you cleared us across? Affirmative, you're cleared across. Okay, great. Because much better to do that, stop for a second and check, than to have him say, what are you doing? There's a guy landing on that other runway, which is also part of the problem. I've often found that people taxi on the ground and they look absolutely straight ahead. And I'm sorry, it comes from too many years of flying with somebody else, but you come up on an intersection, I'll say, okay, we're clear on the right. And somebody says clear on the left, because we both looked up that other runway just to make sure there wasn't somebody on it or about to land or take off on it. And again, it happens, but also tower can make mistakes. I have a friend at one of the airports north of us here, Waukegan, who was taking off on runway 5 to the northeast over the lake, and they had cleared somebody for takeoff on 14, and the two runways intersect. And the controller forgot. He just forgot. And my buddy saw the other guy just having lifted up off the ground as he was lifting, and he made a left turn and went under the guy. But it would have been, it would have been really awful. So that's why you can't be doing something else other than flying the airplane.
Definitely. It's a serious business, and every pilot, whether you fly professionally or not, needs to fly professionally, and a sterile cockpit is just part of flying professionally. Well, Rob, thanks so much for joining us here today and talking about what I think is just an incredibly important topic that just doesn't get the attention that it deserves.
Yeah, and I hope that maybe your listeners enjoyed it as well and learned something. If one or two pilots take something solid away from this, we'll have saved some lives, which to me is the important part of having shows like this. And maybe some of your listeners might want to write in and say, hey, instead of calling it the sterile cockpit, why don't we call it, maybe they'll come up with a name that we can coin and give to this procedure. So, but listen, again, thank you very much for having me on, Max. As always, I really enjoyed it. And for people that don't know, Max is really my younger brother.
That's right. We're family practically. Rob, where do people go to find out more about you and your work?
Well, they'll find Scott Spangler and I at jetwine.com, and we're always updating that. And of course, they'll find me inside the pages of Flying Magazine and who knows where else, but just not at their 12 o'clock and 2 miles opposite direction.
Rob, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
And my thanks to Rob Mark for joining us once again here on Aviation News Talk. And just a quick reminder, please go ahead and use that share button that we talked about. And then after you send this show to a friend of yours, ask them to subscribe to this show, because that's how we grow our audience here. And I really appreciate you taking the time to help grow this show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.